So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. Tonight, we will be talking about the conflict in the Middle East because, as we will see, it continues. So, we will talk about tactical issues as well. The missiles at the Diego Garcia base, the famous missile on the F-35, as well as what is happening on a political level. Because a lot of things are happening, like the deployment of the Marines, the Tripoli ship, which has just arrived at Diego Garcia. So it's starting to move into the area along with the other two ships. Let's also talk about the fact that targeting has changed a lot. In the last 72 hours, the Americans and the Israelis have been hitting Iranian ground forces heavily. It's also true that the Navy basically doesn't exist anymore. In the end, they've destroyed more than 140 ships, including small boats and surface fleet ships. Maggiore. We'll also discuss the strategy mentioned in previous episodes. We had said that the Iranian strategy is to strike the Gulf countries so that they put pressure on the United States. And this worked up until about a couple of days ago, since some countries, including Qatar and others, complained that to reactivate some systems, for example, one of the liquefied gas systems, it will take 3 years. And then we'll show why they're so afraid, because they have huge strategic vulnerabilities linked to some plants that represent 30% of energy production or desalination, things like that. What we said is happening. That is the risk that the Iranian strategy is pushing these countries not only to put pressure on the Americans, but to move directly towards and become part of the red line, and to become co-participants, just to put an end to this story, because they realize that the Americans are not able to do it. We will also explain why the Iranian strategy is difficult to neutralize with just air forces, the famous tunnels and so on, their mosaic defense. Because we all saw in the first week the launch of missiles and drones decrease, then there was a resurgence. And now, to be fair, it's not the same volume as before, but it's about 100 drones, 30 or 40 missiles, but they're constant. This means that they constantly go out and use the shoot and scoot technique, which means the truck goes out, fires, and comes back in. And they have a truly endless quantity of these. But first, let's start with some political/marketing issues, because obviously there are also those who profit from this war. And beyond Trump's jokes, there have been some really big movements. So we have Leonardo Lanzara, Eduardo Fontana for the technical issues, Daniele Moro for the political issues related to America. So please, Daniele, let's start with Trump's statement, where he says they had a long, productive conversation about a complete and total resolution of hostility in the Middle East. Obviously, he's talking about the Iranians. And within 2 hours, the Iranians say, we haven't talked to anyone, and something happened. Please.
Thank you for the invitation. So let's start right away with this, because Trump finished speaking 8 minutes ago at the White House, and he returned to this topic. And basically, he said we are talking with the third generation. That is, he killed the first group, then he killed the second, now only the third remains. He talked about this group as a kind of group of teenagers, a bit fanatical, but basically just kids, as they say in Rome. The point is, if we triangulate, the three countries that seem most active on this front are Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan. My impression, also seeing what's being said in Washington, is that the meetings did take place, probably not directly. But the message is very clear. He got himself into a situation where, as you can see from the polls, his numbers have dropped like a stone in recent days, in which evidently he was convinced, it's now common opinion, that he could resolve the situation like in Venezuela. He realized that these people have no intention of giving in, but as you said, even the Gulf countries hadn't realized how drastic Iran's reaction could be once it was hit. This has created a colossal problem for him in the Gulf. Not only that, but you see, especially when you go to Asia, that this situation of lacking oil, energy, and so on is causing damage to the whole world. He didn't speak at this meeting, which lasted about 40 minutes and ended just a few minutes ago. He didn't talk about issues of inflation or the cost of living because he has no interest in bringing it up. He didn't talk about Lebanon either. If you want, we can try to understand why. Because Trump often needs to be interpreted not for what he says, but for what he doesn't say. He didn't say a word about Israel. He didn't say a word about Lebanon, except he only spoke when they let him. 2 minutes, that's all. It's well known that Trump is someone who can only tolerate so much from others. It's just a few minutes. He said it's an all-American operation with the Israelis. As if to say, we're winning big, said Exit. There have never been people as good as us. They keep insisting that they have the most important armed forces in the world. He just made one of his usual jokes about Ukraine, so Zelensky, Putin. I was convinced I could solve the situation, but honestly, I never imagined these two would. They really hate each other, he says, but look, they really do hate each other. The bottom line is that my impression, and I say this as an old journalist, old in every sense, is that this Italian evening, American afternoon, we'll see what happens in the next few days. I mean, it gave me the impression he wasn't acting cocky there, in the sense that he objectively wasn't able to say whether he could make it or not. I'll say one last thing because you guys are the military experts. I mean, incoming, like Mirko said, the paratroopers are coming there. The issue could be pressure on these talks that they're writing about, which in my opinion are indirect at this stage. And anyway, those who follow this channel know it. If anything, they happen with this person who is the president of the chamber, and it's not clear to what extent. He seems like a kind of Iranian version of the Whitcock-Kuchner duo. They look like Toto and Peppino sent around the world without an interpreter, without maps, talking about who knows what. And then it turns out that in reality, the Iranians have no intention of giving up the atomic weapon. On this, he insisted 56 times. Iran must forget about having the atomic weapon. It's out of the question. I mean, I said no and I said no, and then it's up to them, that's all.
So let's connect a few dots, because in the text from Trump that I showed you earlier, there's also a secondary part. Remember that they already tricked him into coming to talk, and then the Israelis took advantage of it to strike them. So in my opinion, they're keeping a pretty low profile. There's a huge strategic problem. These are the vulnerabilities that Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Jordan, and Iraq have. They all depend a lot on a single facility, meaning that each of them has at least one facility. In the case of Bahrain, there are even 3 facilities which represent almost 30% of the drinking water, desalinated water, and electricity. It means that if you hit these 3 facilities in Bahrain, you take away 30% of their drinking water, desalinated water, and electricity generation. Qatar has more or less the same vulnerabilities. As you can see, most of the countries have exactly this kind of vulnerability. In Trump's message in the second phase, it says, I have stopped. Now I'll bring you back to it so we can read it. I stopped the attacks for 5 days. The war will be postponed basically for 5 days against Iranian power plants, the energy facilities. What happens if he starts hitting these energy facilities in 5 days? Most likely the Iranians will do the same thing to the Gulf countries. And this is something that the Gulf countries cannot allow because they have this intrinsic vulnerability. There is also a change. The Iranian strategy of putting pressure, causing damage to the Gulf monarchies to put pressure on the Americans. Now, slowly, it is leading them to become an active side. The latest news, if you want to discuss Leonardo and Eduardo, is precisely about the fact that not only has Saudi Arabia gone from being passive to we won't respond, we reserve the right to respond if necessary, but it seems they are pressuring the Americans to put an end to it and even to participate themselves. And the same goes for the United Arab Emirates. Obviously, if two of them start, then practically everyone else will join in as well. Because when there is such a big risk, if he attacks the energy system in 5 days, well, inevitably they know that they will most likely lose those systems. And so, since no one has anything to lose, something can really happen there. The disaster where the war really opens up to all countries and not just in a passive defensive role. And this is, I believe, the most terrible scenario we can imagine. Because obviously, sooner or later, we know that the Americans will give up and these monarchies will find themselves in an endless war against Iran.
Yes, but in my opinion, exactly, I agree with what you just said in the sense that I see it too. First of all, greetings to everyone. Sorry, but I didn't have time to do it earlier. I also see this trend, that is, the Gulf countries basically seem more willing to get directly involved in this conflict. So even going so far as to launch perhaps offensive sorties with their air forces, in short, directly participating in the operations. On this, however, the first comment I would make is that all these countries, basically all of them, are already quite entangled in this conflict. I mean, not only from the point of view of being attacked by the Iranian retaliation, but they live in this sort of limbo where their territory in any case is used by the United States. Whether it's because they fly over it, even in some cases for the use of air bases. It's always been somewhat, let's say, denied. But in the end, it came out in these past weeks, even one of the most used air bases. Here, even though we arrive in Jordan, it's actually in Jordan. So one of the most used air bases by the United States Air Force. It's in Jordan, one of the countries that, by the way, at the beginning of the war said we are neutral. So everyone is living in this sort of limbo, with the addition of something that, let's say, has been documented more extensively just in the last few days. Several of the Gulf countries have also allowed the launch of ATACMS missiles, or rather not ATACMS, but the successors of the ATACMS. In some cases, in short, from American HIMARS systems from their territory. And this, of course, happened from there because they wouldn't reach from other places. There are also some videos. So this premise is to say that, yes, basically there is a risk of escalation. From the point of view of seeing the air forces, especially, and also the missile forces of these countries taking part in offensive actions and not just defensive ones, as they already do on their own territories. Obviously, but anyway, in my opinion, they are already quite involved, and maybe the balance wouldn't change that much, because I don't think, maybe I'll also ask Leonardo's opinion on this, I don't think the arsenals, specifically the precision ammunition stockpiles of these countries, can really make a difference in attacking the targets that matter today. That is, the underground missile bases and so on. So I think they couldn't do much more than what the United States and Israel are already doing, obviously. While on the other hand, as Mirko rightly pointed out, there is a risk of suffering critical damage to infrastructure, truly essential infrastructure, which already in the first Iranian reprisals, especially in the first week, were hit a bit. As a man says, with a dead man, a madman, not a dead man. So these Gulf countries, the first reprisal happened, we all saw it, and in my opinion, it was carried out, let's say, not with the intention of hitting specifically the desalination plants. So they didn't really try to hit the most critical infrastructure, but they've already shown they can strike a whole range of sites, which in theory are defended by either some of the most advanced anti-ballistic systems in the world, or at least by very significant air defenses. What does this mean? To say that if in fact they go all in and these countries join so directly into the conflict, as you said, I also agree that there is a very real possibility of seeing these infrastructures damaged or hit. Because in the first days, they didn't show that they were able to defend them sufficiently from this kind of Iranian attacks. then a lot will also depend on the supplies there, on the Iranian ability to keep launching these missiles and drones, which, however, as of today, still seems to remain at a dangerous level.
It's my turn, yes. Hi, everyone. Yes, that's absolutely right. Uh, I'll tell it like this. When this story began, Iran had two possible strategies. The first was to attack military targets, and that's it. So basically, to throw everything they had against the bases in the Gulf area, period. One approach, not asymmetric, but a bit less so. And then the second possibility was to also attack civilian targets, to do what eventually happened. That is, to put political and diplomatic pressure on the Gulf countries on the ground in a way that would affect the population, their sense of security, the legitimacy of what was being done politically, and to push Washington to stop this attack on the chosen one. The second possibility, a much more strategic approach. They sacrificed part of the arsenal that could have been used to strike the Salty base in Jordan or any other American base in the area to put political pressure, right or wrong. On one hand, they could have attacked military targets with more force to have less stuff coming back at them. Because you admit that you start hitting, as has already happened, more air tankers, more fighter bombers, more and more, this stuff comes at you less. But instead, they chose a more political, strategic approach. It makes sense. I don't know if what we were saying with Mirko from the beginning will work. It was this more strategic choice by Iran, which makes sense. It's dangerous because you risk making more enemies. At the beginning, the Gulf countries responded with a strong note of protest, which General Capitini likes, and they didn't say much more. Now, after a couple of weeks, you see we're already starting to see someone chomping at the bit who would want to intervene militarily. Saudi Arabia as an air force in the Gulf region is perhaps the best. The one that has a bit more tradition, a bit more training. I don't know how much because there's someone I won't name who says that the air forces of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are more for show than anything else. They don't have real operational capabilities. They have nice aircraft, nice weapons, but they're not really capable of carrying out missions. I don't know, but I have my doubts too. At this point, Iran, and I'll finish here, has to draw the conclusions from its strategic choice. Did it do the right thing or the wrong thing? Now we'll find out. In the meantime, we've noticed lately many more attacks against Israel. Am I right, Mirko? There has been a shift in activities.
Now I'll show you a graphic that's a bit off in terms of numbers, made by Anadolu, which is a Turkish thing, so it might exaggerate a bit. But the story itself is undeniable, so don't look at the numbers, which in my opinion are double or triple those from all the other sources. But it's undeniable what we've seen between February 28 and March 15. Look at the arrows. This is Iran attacking. More or less distributed a bit towards everyone, a lot towards the United Arab Emirates, quite a bit towards Kuwait, and then decreasingly Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and so on. If you notice, from March 16th to 18th onwards, they practically stopped attacking Oman, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and so on, and everything focused on Israel.
Which makes sense because let's say the head of this idea is more in Tel Aviv than in Washington. Can we say that, or will we be labeled as conspiracy theorists, people who only talk about the Epstein files? Let's be honest, there's a lot of Israeli input behind this story. And maybe the Iranians have realized that their strategy, very strategic, very political, kind of works. And so they start hitting hard at Israel to convince them. And here I think sooner or later we'll talk about interception rates because some do get through, right?
Yes, there's a lot of censorship in Israel. I'm telling you, journalists are blocked and so on. These are the data. You can see the drop February 28th between missiles, drones, 350 missiles, 800 drones, and so on. You can clearly see that around the 8th, between the 8th and the 9th, there's an incredible drop. then you'll notice that they remain constant, and now they're even slightly increasing just a few missiles, because obviously it becomes difficult, as we'll see, to use them. They're being hunted down. You can see lots of videos of bombings targeting individual drone systems under a bridge or outside a tunnel exit and so on. Much less when it comes to drones, which remain constant. If there's a constant, from my military point of view, it means you're not able to reduce the enemy's force response below this threshold. And since this threshold is enough to create a lot of problems for the Gulf countries, I'd say you haven't achieved your goal.
I'll add one thing. From this chart, there's a detail that's evident, maybe not very noticeable. The missiles you see, the ones in red, theoretically include both ballistic and cruise missiles, but as far as I know, in this case, most of them are ballistic. The Iranians use ballistic missiles a lot, and it's true that they seem few when you look at them like this. But just imagine 1,015 ballistic missiles a day for months. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which obviously has a staggering amount of weapons launched, 1,015 ballistic missiles a day is not a small number at all. Obviously, we're not talking about that here.
Let me give you a comparison, Eduardo. The last attack carried out by the Russians involved 300 drones, I think about 10 of various types of Kopaka, and 7 Iskander ballistic missiles. Exactly, but we're talking about an average of 25 to 30 Iskanders per day.
Yes, and in fact, it's something that tends to be underestimated. Because by now we're used to these huge numbers of drones, so we might underestimate the importance that these ballistic missiles actually have. I mean, especially if they have the ability to keep up this pace, I'd say that before long, they'll also have the ability not just to launch the ones they have in stock, inside the mountains, inside the mountain bases, but also some production that continues, at least for certain models. Because now, if I'm not mistaken in this chart, they've counted up to 1,400 missiles launched. Let's say most of these are ballistic. The data on Iran's ballistic weapons stockpiles, of course, changes depending on who is looking at it. But if the war goes on like this for months, obviously those initial stockpiles will be depleted. Basically, and it will be the definitive proof that the Israelis and Americans have not managed to neutralize all of the ballistic weapons production, which is also one of the key objectives. If Iran manages to preserve and move part of the production of at least one short-range ballistic missile model and one medium-range ballistic missile model, let's put it this way, the bare minimum needed to continue threatening at least Israel and the Gulf countries, if they manage to establish production of these two models inside underground bases, or in any case in areas unreachable by the United States and Israel, so generally underground, or at least in the corners of the country that are harder for them to reach. This is a very important card. I'll go back and review it. In a war of attrition, that is, if this war doesn't stop and becomes general like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that's where I want to see, that's where everything we talked about at the beginning of the war will really come into play, about the stockpiles of interceptors, about the production of interceptors, because it's one thing if it goes on for a month or two, and another thing if it goes on longer. With an opponent who can launch 10...
Sorry, they don't need to launch 100 missiles. We've seen it even when they launched 300. In the end, the damage wasn't much, especially to military targets, at least last year's. Today, they managed to hit many targets much more accurately, especially we've seen radar systems, the TADs, and so on. So for them, just to keep a crisis going that becomes politically unsustainable for the Americans, it's enough to launch 100 drones, 25 missiles a day. They probably have enough stockpiles to do this for 6 months or a year, honestly, considering their production as well, so they can maintain this strategy. These are the statistics, country by country. Iranian missiles, ballistic, and drones launched at Saudi Arabia. As you can see, and these instead are in Bahrain, they have gradually decreased. You can see these are against the United Arab Emirates. You can clearly see a decline compared to the initial strategy. What you were saying about the mosaic defense, which I have often mentioned, if you look at Iran, it looks like Moro. If you are surrounded by mountains and there is a valley in the middle, good luck. Trying to invade a country like that is not like Venezuela. It has more than 90 million people. But the hardest part is that they have been preparing for this for 40 years. And these kinds of bases, as you can see, they come out, the famous shoot and scoot, they come out fire, but they stay inside here most of the time. It's true that you can destroy the tunnels and trap them inside, but surely, just like moles, they have dozens and dozens of exits. These are also propaganda images that show you a huge base, but I've often noticed, even in the videos where they've been hit, that sometimes it was just a simple hole. On the side of the mountain, instead, there was a truck. It was a cover for a truck, and they can make as many of these as they want. See, this way of doing things, you can't stop it with air power.
They're like the bunkers in Albania,
I see a question. I'll latch onto the question to make a comment, but it was the question about how many launchers they would still have in service at that time. One of the things people have been saying the most since this latest war started is it's mostly the Israelis who say that Israeli or United States forces have destroyed most of the launchers. So optimistically, especially in the first days, people were saying we've neutralized a good part of the Iranian threat. Now, obviously, from the data we've seen, this is probably not so true. I want to point out that, first of all, of course, I don't know. So the answer is I don't know exactly how many they might still have. I would say to be wary of anyone who claims to know. That's my first answer. But above all, be wary of those numbers, the numbers that are circulating even in the mainstream media. Generally, they come from, in this case, Israeli sources, because they talk about hundreds, if not the last time we got to 300 or something, launches that they then say are either destroyed or unusable. So they also leave themselves a bit of an out. With this statement, however, if we consider that from visual evidence in their videos, which they have every incentive to show, because obviously, by the way, these are all precision attacks. And so a good part, actually, in my opinion, all of these attacks are basically filmed based on visual evidence. We've reached about 40 launches hit, destroyed, and not 300. There you go, there you go, there you go. First, be careful about considering the launchers as something so irreplaceable. They're trucks with, okay, a telescopic launch system, a ramp that moves. In my opinion, it's nothing that high-tech. See, there's a bit too much focus on them as if they're basically irreplaceable. But actually, one of the easiest productions they can restart is that of the launchers themselves.
And then you're talking about the launchers, for missiles, drone launchers.
Exactly. That's basically an APICAR with a ramp, pretty much, yes.
But sometimes all you really need is just a balcony. You don't even need an APICAR. There's someone who brings it to you, and that's it.
I'll show you some more charts just to show that we're cross-referencing. As you can see, there's a huge drop at the beginning and then consistency, which stays more or less the same. As you can see, the data is similar for 30, 20, 25, 38, and more or less for about 100 drones. As you can see with this steady trend, obviously the markets, the pressure. I mean, for the naval insurance companies, whether 25 drones are flying or 100, whether 10 missiles are flying or 30, it doesn't make any difference at all. The fact is, they won't insure you, not even if just one flies, so they can keep more. They're adapting, I imagine. So in adapting, they'll probably increase.
By the way, you can't talk about missiles, but there are mines.
The ships then don't just have to get that, actually. In Hormuz, much more expendable, cheaper, countless things are enough. Even drones, I mean, suicide naval drones, even first-person view drones, they can get there. They'll do little damage, sure, but if they kill the ship's crew, maybe you won't find them so easily anymore, the crew of the oil tanker, who just wants to do their job. Poor guys, it's enough if they just hit the propulsion part each time.
So we're back to the political issue. The oil traders, after Trump's announcement and Iran's denial, are betting on futures and making profits. There was a transaction of, if I'm not mistaken, $1 trillion for 650 million. If you want to explain to us, Daniele, why they're talking about it and how this thing is practically a mission, please go ahead.
Not only are they talking about it, but if you look at various social media platforms practically all over the world, there's a rare consensus in these situations. I mean, practically everyone is saying that there was a colossal insider trading just a few minutes before Trump spoke. And if you go exactly to the fifth, here it is, the fifth paragraph of the statement, BBC. There's the White House's reaction to an accusation that practically has the markets in unanimous agreement. The White House says that we fight insider trading, which is like saying something without really saying it, but basically it's something that originated within our own system. The other consideration, which is more political, brings you back to the whole organization of this second Trump presidency. It's that the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York, so the organization that should theoretically fight insider trading, the last thing they would dream of doing with this president is to go check if someone happened to get rich in 15 minutes. So not only do you have a terrible, basically corrupt message, let's put it this way, you stole, you stole. And from the statement, from the response given to the BBC by the White House, there's a half admission that everything started, and it's the most likely thing in the world. Because it was really difficult to intervene just a few minutes in advance in a situation like this.
Non puoi muovere
Comunque la coscienza.
You can't move $650 million in the span of an hour if you're not already prepared to do it.
Absolutely. Not only that, but you also need to have a system that's ready to handle this kind of bet. And you have to, I insist, know that even if you do get caught and maybe some investigative journalist catches you in the next few days, the Securities and Exchange Commission won't do anything to you at all. I mean, you played within a system where you had information that you weren't supposed to use to the detriment of the markets because you stole money from other investors. It's not like you stole money from who knows who. You stole it from the market. And who's supposed to check the fairness of market operations? You already know that they'll just let you get away with the loot. And good night to everyone. These are operations, and I'll close on this, that actually have been recorded since the beginning of the second Trump presidency. The children have become a joke on the internet for many American podcasts. I mean, Kushner, the money he gets from the Gulf countries. This is an America that even 20 or 30 years ago, whether it was Republican or Democratic, would never have tolerated this level of corruption. This is corruption. This blatant behavior isn't just about coming in, helping out like, I don't know, Putin, and then you let me build 5 hotels in Moscow. Here, the operation is much bigger. You who have
a certain something. Do you remember insider trading at this level for the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War?
Not at this level. No, never at this level. Not only that, but if you think about it, they keep insisting that this cheerful copy, who to me look like Totò and Peppino going to Piazza Duomo in Milan. Famous scene, Nouveau Levine, Savoir, Whitcock and Kushner still sell them as 2 clueless guys traveling around the world, making a mess, understanding little, and Trump is fine with that. Actually, this insider trading operation tells you that the stakes are dramatically higher. I mean, they're not just giving you a second-hand jumbo here. Either the Swiss brought the gold ingot to the president, or poor Machado, the head of the opposition, brought him the Nobel Prize. I mean, this affair has affected and shouldn't be underestimated, the seriousness of it, the global capitalism that invests in New York in the stock market. Because when you make this money, I insist, you've stolen it from someone else.
Who knows, maybe they'll come to invest more in Europe.
No, it's actually the opposite. Look, this is another thing I was keeping an eye on after these speculations. The fact is that a lot of gas carriers that were headed to Europe while all this mess was happening, look at them. These were the Mistral, the Sinsima, Elisardea. Look at the route they're taking. They're all going to Asia. Look, a huge problem is also being created from this point of view. Things that had been ordered by Europe, since in Asia they offered more, they went in that direction. These are some of the most important gas carriers that were heading toward Europe. Look how suddenly, look at the date, because this is the interesting thing. They all suddenly change course. They basically invalidate their acquisition contracts because they received higher offers and they all head to Asia. This is what's happening. And then you wonder why we have 40% more on the gene. By the way, Trump also made threats. Then we'll also get to the European discussion. Participate, come here, go there, go up, go down, because these things change a lot. They change the cards on the table. Luckily, we're almost in spring, so hopefully by winter, the gas situation will be back to normal. But also the situation we saw in Italy with Meloni's move to remove the excise taxes for 2 weeks, something like that. These are things that will calm the market a bit for a few weeks. But if this continues, in 2 weeks, we'll find ourselves with gasoline above €2 again. One thing is something you can sustain unless you're doing it at a loss. And then I give up. For heaven's sake, I can use emergency funds for these things too. Here, though, it's not like we're drowning in money and gold. These days in Europe, we see what's happening.
The risk is stagflation, stagnation, and inflation,
which we already had because of energy issues. We go from one crisis to another just as we're recovering. About having cut off gas and oil from Russia, we look for alternative sources. And these alternative sources were partly theirs too, even if the dependence was long-standing. The point is, you can't just replace 20 or 30% of supply all at once. So you go from one crisis to another, and the market practically never has a chance to recover, because you find yourself in a crisis where you pay more for gas for 2 years, then it stabilizes, and then there's another crisis again, from crisis to crisis. Then the base price becomes higher than what we saw compared to 2022. So it's a big problem. We'll see about that later, how Germany is doing, how France is doing, also internal political issues. We know that probably in the coming years, the right-wing parties will win in various countries. No, Le Pen, her protege, probably Farage's party in England, will probably try to contain things. They alternate with Für Deutschland. But crises help nationalists a lot, because you've seen it. You wanted global European politics. You wanted to take part in this war here, up there, down there. And so they will rise. In my opinion, rising also means thinking more about themselves. No, Leonardo. Yes, yes. European maneuvers to patch up a situation altogether, but everyone for themselves.
Well, but there's one thing Europe should do. Sorry to interrupt you. Nuclear power. And this is a phase where we need someone to show some guts and say, gentlemen, we need to free ourselves from this situation. Green energy is fine, but green energy is inconsistent compared to a nation's needs. We need to pull nuclear energy out of the hat again. Greetings to the lawyer of the atom. But nuclear energy, are there already people talking about nuclear for military purposes? Building a European deterrent, nuclear, fine.
Build your own deterrent, my friend.
Well, I have my own deterrent. I eat a lot of beans. That's it. Then we have to think about nuclear energy, about fourth generation reactors exactly from this perspective. The problem here is that they can't be ready in a month. We're behind. In Italy, we're behind because we've already rejected it twice because we're so smart. But at the European level, we need to do more for nuclear energy, and things are starting to move.
Yes, there's also a typical attitude in Italy. You know, we hold a referendum on nuclear energy and Chernobyl, then we have a second Fukushima. Brilliant. You really nailed it. 2 out of 2 of the possible ones. If we Westerners are suffering despite being the richest countries, how is the rest of the world doing? That's exactly the point. The more industrialized countries are, the more they depend on energy, oil, fertilizers, and these things. Paradoxically, a developing country needs less of these things because it doesn't have such a mechanized industry like we do, for example, in northern Italy. So it's something that we feel, especially us, who have to move hundreds, thousands of trucks every day to transport things. So going from 1.7, I remember that gasoline was 1.60, at least where I'm from, until about a month and a half ago, and now it's 35 cents more. Think about what that does to the price of potatoes, to the price of truckloads of milk, or anything else that gets transported. it becomes huge on really large volumes. Let's get to the famous Diego Garcia story. We talked about it in a short, but we haven't talked about it yet, let's say, here on the channel. The two missiles. Go ahead, Leonardo. I'm following you. Then with the slides.
So it was a surprise to see flying apparently two missiles each, intermediate range ballistic missile. So intermediate range, about 4,000 kilometers from Iran to the Anglo-American base at Diego Garcia. A surprise because what everyone knew was that the Iranians could reach 2,000, maybe 2,500 kilometer range. A limit that the Iranian regime had imposed on itself, also to avoid attracting too much attention from the Europeans. Here, this animation shows us the range. The impact didn't happen because it seems that one of these two missiles fell during flight, malfunctioned, I don't know. And the other was intercepted by an SM-3, a missile launched by the Americans guided by the Aegis system. The SM-3 is a missile that we talked about 2 years ago on this channel, talking about the first space war in history, nothing sensational. The Houthis launched a medium-range missile at Israel, which was intercepted outside the atmosphere. An exoatmospheric engagement. In this animation that Mirko is showing you, you can see this object, which is the kill vehicle. Why? Because the SM-3 is a missile. It's a multi-stage missile. The last stage is the kill vehicle. You see these flames going in all directions. What are they? Because when you go past 100 kilometers in altitude, the Kármán line, there's no more air to support flight and control. So if you want to steer where there's no air, the solution is small jets of matter, and usually they're small thruster engines. So you don't use fins to steer an object flying outside the atmosphere because there's no air to push against to move, so you use these small jets instead. The SM-3 has already shown good results against intermediate range missiles in the past, and in this case, it might have worked. So where do these 4,000 kilometers come from? Well, there are two facts. One, either they lightened the warhead of a Kármán Char 4 or a Sejil 2, and so by reducing the weight of the warhead, you increase the range, and maybe you can reach 4,000 that way. Or a Sejil 3 was launched, which is a 3-stage version of this ballistic missile, which was said to be in the testing phase. Not operational, it was being talked about. I found conflicting reports, we don't know, but I hypothesize, and here Dr. Fontana can correct me if I'm wrong. If we reduce the weight of a missile's warhead, it's not like we just double its range as it is, because that would also mean unbalancing the missile. I understand that if you reduce the warhead, you reduce the weight, and so the missile goes farther. But you have to do things properly, otherwise the missile becomes hard to control, especially during the descent phase. And I suspect that the fact that one of these two missiles was destroyed in flight for its own reasons could be due precisely to a reduction in the warhead. In a somewhat rushed or not well-engineered way, I don't know, but again, I repeat, we're in the realm of hypotheses and speculation. The important thing, and then I'll finish, is the psychological effect of something that can reach 4,000 kilometers. Because friends and colleagues, the day after it happened, asked me if now Iran can also strike against Europe.
Then we'll connect it, since with Eduardo we'll also talk about a greater involvement of American bases in Europe. Because people in the Middle East are less active as they suffer increasing damage over time.
I'll add something about Diego Garcia since we're discussing it. I basically agree with the analysis of why one actually fell. It's one of the most likely hypotheses. Having modified, maybe in a hurry, let's say, with little time available, one of the missiles that in theory reach about 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers at most. Obviously, there's the possibility of creating a sort of prototype that's a bit modified, not subject to malfunctions. I'll add that, if I'm not mistaken, the Americans said that the one that was shot down, I think, yes, either that one or the other one. I think The one that was shot down about 3,200 kilometers from Iran. I mean, it hadn't actually reached the outposts. Also because, as we've seen, the SM-3S intercept much earlier than impact. So in my opinion, this is an important factor because it doesn't mean that we're certain they can reach us, but that they could. And I'll add another detail which I think is important to mention. The Iranians have denied carrying out this attack. Obviously, it's not that we can't have evidence. The only ones who probably have any proof are the crew of the destroyer or those who saw the radar. Oh God, honestly, I haven't really made up my mind about whether this is some kind of fake or not. It should be noted that in other cases, up until now, every attack has basically been claimed, if I'm not mistaken, by the Iranian side. Except maybe those in Turkey, there are some doubts there too. In this case, the fact is that actually, as Leonardo also said, it is possible to increase the range of these missiles. Because these are missiles that not only already have a significant range, but also often have a very heavy warhead. So you can, as rightly...
No, Eduardo. Many missiles are designed to have multiple warheads of different types from the start. Look, all Russian missiles, for example, can be nuclear or kinetic.
Sometimes, exactly, this possibility is already considered during the design phase. One last factor that comes to mind. There has also been talk of a possible use even of the launch vehicles that Iran uses to send satellites into orbit. They have some which should be even more powerful, but that would basically be something new. And by the way, in my opinion, it's the least likely of all the hypotheses we can put on the table. So that's it. I'll leave these doubts about Diego Garcia. Thank you all.
I have an alternative hypothesis that could both make us think about why. You know, the Iranians denied the Diego Garcia theory, telling a half-truth, meaning that maybe they were heading towards some ship, not toward Diego Garcia.
So in that case...
They were heading toward Diego Garcia.
But if we are to believe the distance where the incident happened, the incident at 3,200 kilometers, I remember that some Iranian sources before the war even talked about anti-ship ballistic missiles that could reach 1,500 kilometers, which is already something really crazy, 3,000 kilometers. I consider it totally implausible for the simple fact that from the moment you launch the missile, by the time it comes down, the ship has already moved. I don't even know, maybe even 60 or 70 kilometers, something that, in my opinion, is implausible. Another detail that comes to mind now is that so this dynamic that the American and Israeli sources have described, this attempted attack, is true then. Even if we just believe the figure of 3,200, let's say, they managed to get that far. Anyway, this would mean reaching an important part of Europe and Sicily as well, even part of mainland Italy. Then, depending on how far they actually manage to get, if they actually manage to take care of themselves. Obviously, as we saw in the graph, it puts a large part of Europe at risk. And I always remind everyone that on one hand, it makes very little sense for Iran to launch this kind of ballistic missiles into Europe because the accuracy would be absolutely ridiculous. And as we said, they would have to reduce the warhead so much that you can't even compensate for the poor accuracy with a large warhead. So they would only be used for political purposes, let's put it that way. But on the other hand, I don't think they'll do it, obviously. But they would still be difficult to intercept in some areas, while in much of Europe, however, they should be interceptable by Aegis systems, especially those in Romania, and technically also by United States Navy destroyers near Cyprus, which are also equipped with the SM-3 missiles we mentioned earlier. That is, if these assets are in position, we should be protected from limited launches. However, if, for example, the United States Navy destroyers were not in position. For example, I found a simulation that showed Sicily as the only Italian area that was a bit exposed. But these are just cases. I don't want to cause alarm. We should take a more friendly, family-oriented approach.
So, before answering the question that Daniele will answer about whether anything is being said about the Epstein files, I wanted to respond to something I was reading. Caracciola said those completed tours required them to be Israeli. Now, no offense. For the director, if the Israelis fired missiles that travel 3,200 kilometers, the whole planet would see where they were launched from. They don't have aircraft launch capability to launch a missile with a plane that travels 3,200 kilometers toward Diego Garcia. They would have to launch missiles from Israel, but the whole world would see it.
In my opinion, at most what is possible is that in the Turkish case, which was a bit unclear, more simply, it could have been an Iranian missile as well, but aimed at Cyprus, which anyway, if you remember, have always been intercepted in that area of Turkey, which is next to Syria. Basically, the one that goes a bit, let's say, adjacent to Syrian territory, a trajectory passing through there could actually be aimed either at Turkey or at Cyprus. The fact is that since they are intercepted, as Leonardo showed very well earlier, outside the atmosphere, because in that case too, they were interceptors. SM-3 from the ships near Cyprus, the same ones that protect those I mentioned earlier in that case. For us analysts, it's a bit impossible to understand where they were headed, except that they were still a bit far from the point where they were intercepted. So, as a hypothesis, in my opinion, it makes sense that maybe they were headed towards Cyprus, which we know still has a role in the war, being attacked by drones. So that maybe can be explained more easily.
Leo, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you know of any missile that can go over 3,000 kilometers launched from an Israeli plane?
No, they have a ballistic missile. They have air-launched ballistic missiles, but 3,000 kilometers, absolutely not.
Absolutely. It's a bit of Occam's razor.
Technically possible.
No, come on. But then there are satellites that detect launch traces, the infrared traces of a launch. The Russians, the Chinese, just imagine if it comes out that Israel did something like that.
The Americans will see it. It is
I think
that advertising, I mean,
it should be a showcase of their nuclear deterrence.
some say from submarines, but the Iranians don't have missile launching submarines of this range. They had some anti-ship ones, and anyway, all their submarines are out of commission.
India could do it, but come on, guys, no.
No, I don't know who's on the technical advisory team, honestly.
And then if we want to think like a conspiracy theorist, I mean, it's much simpler to think that it's just fake news since the source is them. I mean, why go so far as to believe that they actually launched a missile from Israel? Couldn't it just be that Israel put out this news? Then for goodness sake, I have no idea. So I would be more cautious.
Daniele, if there is any news about the Epstein files, if it has been forgotten, and as a connection, there's another question. For what reason? Vice President Vance has recently been less present compared to, let's say, his appearances alongside the president. He has somewhat disappeared from the scene. Is there a reason? Because Rubio seemed to be the least favored during the negotiations with Ukraine, but now suddenly Rubio has come to the forefront and Vance has disappeared. So first Epstein and then Vance.
So in the Italian media, the whole story seems to have disappeared. And in the American media, it gets very little coverage for obvious reasons. In the English media, the story is huge. It's interesting. Epstein scandal, New York, the Caribbean islands. Actually, it's causing a cataclysm in the system. Not only in the English monarchy, but also in the case of the English Prime Minister, who was chosen in a completely irresponsible way as the new ambassador to be sent directly to Trump, Mandelson, whom everyone knew was involved in the scandal. Epstein, regarding the Epstein scandal, I, who don't believe in conspiracy theories based on my experience, don't believe he disappeared. Because Trump waged war against Iran and making the American public forget about it, I don't believe it. What I'm sure about is that the game is far from over. I've always said, and I also want to give credit to Parabellum, who was months ahead of the Italian media on this story. The Epstein scandal is not just a sexual scandal. It involves a series of perverts, but it also has business dealings. Massive money laundering, a lot of it, and it's already proven in many congressional records. By the way, the other day, the former FBI director died. And Trump didn't miss the chance to say his usual vulgarities, especially when someone dies. He said, "Oh, no, these things." Mueller conducted an investigation, and the investigation, at least in the part concerning the Russians, heavily involved the Russians in relation to the United States of America and in the Epstein case. I'll repeat it. since we've discussed this for months. There is international money laundering through Deutsche Bank in Moscow and Deutsche Bank in New York. In many cases. In construction, be careful. The central point is money. The second is information, blackmail. Because there are
also the Israeli services. Let's say that from this point of view, there are some shady things. They were useful for finding out what your weakness was, offering it to you to hook you. And then they talked about business connections and other things.
So the secret services, but I mean, even in Italy, for those who remember history, during the events of General De Lorenzo's piano solo, the famous dossiers that were made on politicians, which at the time could have ruined a career, because I don't know. One was homosexual, another was the president of the Italian Republic, he was cheating on his wife, or more likely the wife was cheating on the president, and so on. Dossiering has always been done. The Epstein affair is still dangerous. I mean, I keep thinking one thing. The Epstein affair is far from over in America. Trump manages to keep it covered up. Because, as we said earlier about the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the equivalent of the Italian Consob, the Department of Justice is the first center of power in the American administration that Trump took control of. But not to bring clarity, rather to prevent the famous names from coming out. The other 3 million files that have been collected in the FBI, which also belong to the FBI. I'll tell you one last thing.
Daniele, wait, so we can also answer. So they say the theory would be that the United States of America is so full. Israel, because they have Trump by the balls on apps, it's not us saying it. The head of American counterterrorism under Tulsi Gabbard resigned. And he also had a wife who died in Iraq saying, I don't agree with this war. The Israeli lobby is the reason why they dragged us in. So it's not me saying it, it's Daniele Moro. A high-ranking American counterterrorism official says it. He was the deputy director or the director. So we're talking about very high-level figures in American intelligence.
All right, let's get right into it. This part is very interesting. In the past few days, a split occurred, but it only exploded in the last few days. These resignations that Mirko mentioned are, let's say, the most public part of the story. A colossal split within the MAGA world. So to simplify, within the American center-right, one part remains as it has historically, pro-Israel, while another part has gone completely in the opposite direction. That is, they say here we are facing a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. The most well-known one, which many will know, is Tucker Carlson. The division is very strong. There is a split regarding Israel, not only in the center-right, but also, let's call it the center-left. Even within the Democratic Party. And very interestingly, the split is also generational. Young Republicans tend to break away from the traditional Republican Party solidarity toward Israel and take opposing positions. The same goes for young Democrats. This split is also connected to another aspect. Mirko, you actually noticed this from the very first days of the war in Iran. That is, a part of the wizarding world said to Trump, "Dear President, you told me to vote for you because otherwise Biden, Obama, and Harris would start World War III. You said no more wars, but in 14 months, you've started 8 of them." I mean, he even managed to go as far as bombing Nigeria. Not only that, but the serious thing is that this time, and this is what we're talking about tonight, you got yourself into a conflict that no one in the world knows how you're going to get out of. And look, the meeting we were talking about earlier, an hour and a half ago, gave me that impression. That the first one who doesn't know how he's going to get out of it, beyond all the talk, no, I'm the smartest in the world, as handsome as me, is him. Third point, closely related to this. Vance had already disappeared, if you remember, on the Saturday night of the operation in Venezuela, where they cobbled together that sort of mini summit at Mar-a-Lago. If you look at the images with a curtain behind, 4 panels, trying to mimic the White House. So the very famous photograph of Obama, Biden, Clinton at night, which was actually a Sunday, around 10 p.m. Washington time, I followed it. From there, by the way, practically in real time, the capture of bin Laden. Already in the Maduro operation, Vance was not present. In these weeks, he continues not to be present. You probably saw this morning that the news from Pakistan said maybe the man we Pakistanis find most suitable to have a chat with the Iranians could be Vance himself. This evening, Trump also mentioned him, but let's say he made, just to be clear, 10 names. Rubio, Kushner, Witkoff, and he said twice, there's also Vance, but he wasn't present, mind you, he wasn't present. My impression, honestly, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, from my experience, is that this split is still there. Some polls last week said that about 15% of those who voted for Trump don't agree with this operation, less than I expected.
There's a choice by Vance, considering the choices of let's say Vance was an opportunist. He used to say he was Hitler. Trump was Hitler. He said that 5 years ago. It's not that he, seeing how things are collapsing.
He says, absolutely, yes, I'll challenge like this.
The Republicans.
After they have
a candidate who hasn't burned out.
But absolutely, yes. I agree with you. This is a choice of, on one hand, consistency, in the sense that you say it's you, Trump, who changed your mind, not me. I represent that world, and let's say 15% of the electorate and 85%.
Also because this way,
sorry, Daniele,
you can act tough and pure and say, I'm the true heir of the MAGA.
But that's how it is. So what we're trying to clarify here means that within the majority that brought Trump to the elections, there are issues on which the majority is divided. One is Israel, 2 is the Epstein affair. I remind you that Trump was forced by Parliament to release a statement, a heavily censored part of the documents on Epstein, because Republican voters told their representatives, you ran your entire campaign saying that if we voted for you, once you returned to power, you would open the drawers, and you didn't do it. So, and now, at this point, you have the third topic, which is the Make America Great Again movement. That is on 3 key points. That's why I keep insisting, don't underestimate Epstein. It's less discussed, but God's wrath still brews beneath the surface. I'll add one last detail about London. The serious situation doesn't just concern Starmer, but also the King. The King was brought up by one of the best investigative journalists, the Englishman Andrew Lowney, who is the equivalent of Mike Wolfe in the United States. I think they're the 2 top journalists in the world on this. Epstein, Lowney discovered that the £12 million that former Prince Andrew paid to the young girl who later committed suicide were not given only by the Queen, as everyone had thought for years, but out of the 12 million, 2 million were put in. The current one of England then becomes, isn't it that you saw that the mother was protecting her son from the scandal of the affair? No, you aware. I mean, you had all the tools to know that the Epstein scandal is a colossal scandal in which a lot of people, in my opinion, are still blackmailing each other.
There's a question for you. What is the position of Vance's dark patron, Peter Thiel, on these interventions? For the latter, these are 2 messes to further promote Palantir. We've seen it with the Palantir versus speech. What's it called, that Anthropic, etc., the various Pentagon deals and so on. I mean, Peter Thiel could actually benefit from these hesitations by Anthropic. We've talked about it in the live streams on artificial intelligence with Barbato. How much influence does Peter Thiel have on Vance's story? Because I know he was kind of his, let's say, formative father and so on. And Peter Thiel also has his own ideas. Anyway, I recommend him to you.
So in my opinion, we'll have to wait a few weeks to understand how the situation develops. But this question is interesting. Honestly, I hadn't thought about it. It's very interesting for a reason. You have to imagine that the White House is simply, historically, the end point of what we could call the powers that be. Powers that be are not just the big capitalists, but also the unions, certain administrations, but it's very powerful. The Jewish lobby, for example, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, historically very strong, and so on. In my opinion, there's also a split within the power system that on the day of Trump's inauguration was completely united, all applauding him. I mean, in my opinion, there's something going on beneath the surface that's also affecting what we could call the American new economy. There's someone who's been way too quiet in the past few weeks. I insist, even on these extremely powerful people, not just powerful like Till, like Musk, and so on, the silences of the past few days speak louder than many statements. There are a lot of people waiting to see what happens. So Leonardo was explaining earlier a
thing. So maybe the colleagues are making some strange moves. Beyond Palantir, which is used as artificial intelligence, is involved in the conflict and so on. Then he founded, together with Luke, basically Anduril. He got obsessed with stuff from the Lord of the Rings, Palantir, Anduril, the Flame of the West, Sword of Aragorn, and so on. Now he is aiming right at this moment to replace Silicon Valley Bank with Erebor. So there's a movement. Grotto wants to get into military procurement, into artificial intelligence, which is already happening, and now also at the banking level.
Absolutely, yes. What I mean is that the White House is a terminal for the powerful interests. It's not like in other countries, I don't know, in France, where the president of the republic also often has a formidable influence over state-owned companies, public enterprises, and so on. The White House is simply the endpoint of clashes between capitalists. Insanely powerful. I'll give you an example of a company everyone knows, Coca-Cola. If you look at what the Coca-Cola lobby is in Washington, but it's 100 times more influential than the President of the United States of America. But when did they try to reduce the sugar? But you have to see what these lobbies are like. I mean, all the power of global capitalism doesn't depend on Trump. He's the one trying to influence decisions, in this case of the Pentagon or American finance. So you definitely have some clashes. I mean, the front that supported Trump is also, in this case, in my opinion, much less united, because everyone has their own interests. They are also competitors. I mean, they were united in supporting Trump, who came to try to destroy Europe. He eats cream on the sly. But in reality, they have huge interests on a capitalist level. Let's say, what is the conflict about? You can be a friend of Trump, an enemy of Trump, but in the end, your interests are your interests. So that something might happen, even regarding these events, I wouldn't rule it out.
There are negotiations underway, but I don't know on what basis. I mean, if Trump said that we talked, that it was a productive meeting, and they say that there was no meeting, at least officially, maybe it was second or third tier people talking to each other. I don't know on what basis Witkoff and Kushner are working on the ceasefire mechanism. On what basis, if those people say there was no meeting besides? I mean, Trump says 5 days. These people say a month, and they say at least get your story straight, be on the same page. I'm just asking for some consistency about the line to follow. Otherwise, everyone does their own thing. Then you say maybe it's the Iranians who are confused, and I believe it. One says one thing, these guys say something else. In fact, there was a month of fire, and then...
But in the meantime, you have to take the 5-day one. What a coincidence. Look what day it ends.
Yeah, I know. At the end of the week, don't tell me,
Thank you.
I mean, when the Marines arrive, good job, Leonardo.
And then someone checked that they actually stopped attacking.
Today is Tuesday, Sunday makes 5 days. Just look at that.
I'm taking advantage of this because we've lined up a few things that I wanted to bring up at the right moment. But it's also nice when things come up spontaneously. We always say that. All the attacks that happened at the end of the week, what a coincidence in the last few days. Just look at how life goes. In your opinion, what have the American targets focused on in the last few days? We've seen a lot of videos, if you remember, of launch systems, planes, ships, and so on. Right, guess and riddle. So, what have been the main targets of American and Israeli bombings and missile attacks in the last 3 days?
Ground forces like this?
By chance.
Ground forces.
And what a coincidence.
Even on the islands, which would be, let's say, the most exposed.
No, it's not Karg.
It's not Karg. No, it's not Karg. Karg is worse.
It's not Karg. It's not Karg. It's Karg.
Which, by the way, have been occupied by Iran, but are actually claimed by the Emirates. It's interesting to see this progression over the last 3 days, where the mechanized forces have been hit. So those that could intervene quickly, as well as the forces at a distance. In the Strait of Hormuz, there are movements of the Marines. They take a 5-day break. It's the weekend. Meanwhile, they are bombing the ground forces. You don't need a magic lamp or some special taste to see this.
One of the two amphibious groups, we can even see it from certified satellite images, has arrived at Deco Garcia. So these aren't just rumors. Then United States sources also mention an airborne division which should be put on alert. Now, oh God, well, here we could open up a huge discussion. The meaning of this operation risks everything. In my opinion, it can only make sense precisely on some islands near Hormuz, basically, but it still remains something that risks opening up a Pandora's box that leaves you entangled for I don't know how long. It's not exactly a given that opening those islands would then allow civilian traffic in the Strait of Hormuz to pass through smoothly. On the contrary, it seems to me that just to find a way out, they're risking getting themselves even deeper into the hole, if you'll pardon the expression. They risk getting us stuck in there too.
You can't escape the shell.
Of anti-access and redenial bubbles. Let's say everything goes well, a good landing, perfect planting, but then the Hormuz is still within range. There's the mine issue. There are drones. You can't create a 100% safe bubble to reopen it.
And then, by the way, the same Marines would be on islands just a few dozen kilometers, sometimes even less from the shore. I mean, unless they think they can secure it. To deny the Iranian armed forces the use of hundreds of kilometers of coastline, which I don't think even Trump on his most entertaining day would say. It really seems like something extremely risky to me. Because then there are Marine units there that, okay, they occupy the islands. Maybe they set up some images. Obviously, they install anti-aircraft and anti-drone systems. They do something to prevent attacks. Even just some radars are useful to help a bit more with the defense of merchant ships. But now, once again, it remains a new and gigantic target. I mean, the same Marines can even be bombarded by artillery, and then by a range of weapons that are really cheap.
It must be said that we've seen the A-10 as the Super Hornets, even strafing right on the coasts.
In some areas, they even seem to have this freedom. Well, this freedom, by the way, in my opinion, it's still something quite dangerous. Because the threat of man-portable air defense systems, the threat of shoulder-fired missiles, I don't think it can be completely neutralized, not even in the most
Personally, I think it makes more sense to take the island of Kargi for the supplies so you can really squeeze them by the neck, because there aren't 2,000 of them on the little islands in the Strait of Hormuz anyway. That would prevent them from causing trouble, from launching drones and so on. In fact, maybe even having some troops there. For the Iranians, it's just a waste of time since it's hard to hide. Besides, the Iranians also have other methods beyond drones and so on. Let's also talk about mines, so we can introduce this topic as well, because there's been a lot of speculation. There are Wall Street Journal articles that talk about 1,013 mines that are already in place. But we've seen that the Iranians have allowed some Chinese, Indian, and Russian ships to pass through at a cost of 2 million per passage, passing very close to their coast. If there are mines, I don't know if there's selective mines. I don't think they can.
I think they've mined the area, which is the main corridor, the one from below that huge island of Kashmir down to the peninsula.
The route, let me tell you, passes close to our coasts, in my opinion.
But it's clear where the few permitted ships pass through. What they've done is mine and indiscriminately hit everything they detect in the main corridor, which is basically in the widest part of the strait. While if you go and look on all the tracking sites, it's very simple, to tell you the truth. Even in some newspapers, basically, the trajectory comes out. Of these few ships that have been allowed to pass, basically, as you said, they make them go very close to their coasts in an area where they can even stop them, or at least visually confirm that they are really those ships. And so, in my opinion, it's very easy for them not to mine that stretch of the strait near the coasts. And in fact, even if a ship they wanted to hit tried to pass, they could easily hit it with a whole series of mines. Whereas the mines you see here, some models can be freely used in the main stretch, which is farther from the coasts. It's more difficult for Iran to control and identify. It's harder to identify ships in that stretch, so they have to be hit completely in an indiscriminate way.
The powerful means of Rai managed to find those who pass through.
Exactly. You see, the transit should actually be near Kashmir Island and north of that small island called Larak, if I'm not mistaken. So it's right in front of the Iranian coast. It's not at all the corridor that was used by commercial ships before the war. It's a new corridor. They actually invented it ad hoc in these hours just to make them identifiable to the Iranian armed forces. And the mines, by the way, today, or at least in the last few days, there seem to be the first signs that they have been deployed. Here, yes, perfect. You can really see it here if you go back a bit, Mirko. Those red ships you see, they pass right close under Bandar Abbas. That's the new corridor they've basically started for anyone who wants to make agreements with Iran and pass through. Whereas the main corridor was just a bit further north of Kasab, basically just north of the peninsula. And there, excuse me, because that route is so close, and in my opinion, it's exactly the right route. Because that's the one where they feel safe. Since it's so close, that's the one for them. Then my opinion, my reasoning is this. Iran says if you want to pass, make agreements with us, but then it's not like they trust them.
Well, if you don't pay, I'll shoot you. You have to pass through the gauntlet of 2 islands controlled by them.
I mean, there it's really like you can't fool them, basically. If you pretend to be, because I've even seen on tracking sites, sometimes you see some ships that write, "We are Chinese," even with the help of others. It would come up, they'd change the name, and even the automatic identification system identifier, they'd write, "We are Chinese, Chinese crew," and sometimes they actually weren't. So there are always things like that too. Now we're making a joke out of it, but obviously there's very little to laugh about because in the end, it's also about the crews of these ships. Certainly, it's not like they're having a good time, yes, during this period, but these kinds of tricks are also played out in the field. And so this is a way to let them pass so close to avoid getting scammed. From the Iranian point of view,
how did Iran hit these American movements and anti-missile radio systems when they hadn't been there for months? Apart from the fact that radars don't just not exist, they're exposed. Radars are huge structures. It should also be said, as we mentioned in the first live streams, that the war broke out because of an issue of opportunity. Because at that moment they had gathered, they probably had to do it before the schedule. They had already been emptied. I mean, the bases were already empty. They were still at a minimum staff level, but probably that's exactly why, because there was only minimal staff. There hadn't been time to secure what was, let's say, on the pads in this sense. And then they're not such important targets. I mean, it's much worse to lose the TAD radar system or fixed radars that cost several billion than that.
In some cases, the TAD radars, I think, at least in the case of the United Arab Emirates, still had a decoy. I mean, for every TAD radar in every base, there should be a fake radar. Basically, this was visible from satellite in some of the bases that were later hit. But still, I mean, in the end, it seems they managed to hit the real one. In those cases, then,
if you're really interested in seeing satellite images, etc., I recommend Epic Fury Map on X, which did an amazing job putting together all the geolocations. It's also picked up by many others, including even some companies that produce satellite images. They praised him. So if you want to follow, I'll put it in the chat. Here, basically, the main things about the events are posted every day. Let's say verification technicians, let's put it that way. If you scroll down, as you can see, it's all with satellite images before and after, both regarding Iran and other countries. Here you can make a comparison to see, the XY's base was hit. Here you find the cross checks complete with verification.
Ordinate immagini satellitari del primo.
You can compare, there's not much to say. XYZ was hit. Here you find cross checks for verification.
Sia
You can make one from the West Central Command, which shows the destruction for A.
Ukel Barajamali.
It's from XYZ. You can find cross checks with full verification.
Il danno subito. Ve lo consiglio perché
You can. As you can see, even the data center hit in Abu Dhabi is trying to make comparisons to see it was XY that was hit. You can find the cross checks and satellite images, even some videos. I've noticed that many people are collaborating on this, including Geolocalized and others. There's the whole story of cross-checking. You can find a comparison of what was hit here.
Visto che scusa se ti interrompo, visto che
you can do it in the Mizar Vision chat. Anyway, let me comment on this. Be careful, because especially on X, it was banned a few days ago, but there was a Mizar Vision profile. You can find this Chinese company that publishes satellite images, and sometimes actually satellite images, not just satellite images, but satellite images, often with comments, with counter verification. You can compare to see the affected areas have been hit. They have also been republished from Mizar Vision. But my comment was about this, meaning be careful, because Mizar Vision is the original one. Let's say on Western social media, let's call them that, there is also on a Chinese social media called Weibo, or at least the pronunciation. I hope that's correct. And you can't do a... Some people repost the images, which is fine. They're a great source. But be careful, because other times there are fake accounts that pretend to take an image from a Mizar Vision, and actually they're not authentic images. One went around a lot last week to see hit by XYZ. You can find the counter checks from a comparison for Iranian. Now, the attack was real, but the image wasn't, also because it should have been a radar image, and so in theory the clouds shouldn't have been visible. But it was one of those cases where the account, which seemed to be the official Mr. Vision Swiss account, published it and then got banned. Because it turned out that account wasn't the official one, but since the beginning of this war, that account was very popular, maybe one of the most followed in this category. So on X, be careful, you can always find the counter checks from Controverifica. You can make a comparison, it's highlighted, you can find it and trace back to the original post on the Controverifica account.
tanto questa è una mappa che mette in grafica.
You can...
In verde ci sono gli attacchi.
XYZ was hit. You can find the counter checks on Controverifica. Here you can make a comparison. See, she was hit. a XYZ's base, American, and this is the Israeli area of responsibility. Here you can find the counter checks with Potato. A comparison is Trump. We are working, but if you look at how many bombings have been carried out in the northwest part of the country compared to the south, you can clearly see who has invested more. And this is a huge effort for the Israelis, considering that they used more than 200 planes out of the 280 or 300 they have available. And notice how the Iranian responses are against Israel. They're coming back, especially in the latest developments. It's hit. You can find the countercheck. You can compare to see.
It's hit. You can find the countercheck.
You can make a comparison. It's hit. You can find the countercheck.
I wanted to point out something here. We're talking about territorial division between two different nations, which divide the areas and also have a certain coordination. But how long had they been working on this operation, I ask? I don't know, because it's not easy to plan and carry out all these operations. By doing some deconfliction, so also avoiding shooting. The allies avoiding hitting the same targets twice. I wonder how long they had been working on a coordinated operation like this, because it was super coordinated from the very beginning. From electronic warfare, missile launches to airstrikes from two different nations. This isn't something you organize for next week.
That's exactly why they don't overlap, except when there are interventions by the B2 Spirito. When there are the bombers, the Strigeli, usually there's an overlap. What the Israelis can't do, the Americans do. But as far as classic air intervention is concerned, which can be suppression of enemy air defenses, destruction of enemy air defenses, whatever you want, everyone has their own area of expertise. So they've actually divided the areas to avoid problems. And it's interesting to note that most of the incidents were experienced by the Americans, both friendly fire incidents and incidents from their own technological point of view. Unless the Israelis completely censor their own incidents, we can't know this. Let's get to what happened with the F-35, because it's one thing to talk about it in a short and another thing to have a bit more time to discuss it. It's not that, because people always complain. It's not that I made the short about the F-35, because, oh my God, the Iranians are winning, if they had even shot it down, and that's not the case. But why does it make history? It's interesting to point out a couple of technical things. First of all, usually when Iranians show videos of shoot downs, for example, of Reaper drones, etc., they show you the video in its entirety. That is, from when the missile is fired, it hits the target catches fire, becomes a fireball, and they leave it there the whole time. Coincidentally, in the video of the F-35, they showed us instead, boom, at a certain point it gets cut. Now, if I hit a 5th generation aircraft and I was at war with the United States or Israel, I think I would have every interest. Not only to film everything, but also to go and find some pieces to show. No, none of this happened. Please, Leonardo.
Do you want to show the video?
Yes.
So the video shows footage taken with an infrared camera.
Now I'll show you. Here it is.
Here it is. The video is not verified, it's not authenticated, but let's try to understand something. So we've already seen the grid in other interception videos, which later turned out to be real. It's not contextualized. There's no location, speed, altitude of the aircraft. There's nothing. You see, there's no reference number. It's completely out of context. It seems that the interception happened in the early afternoon. You see a thermal camera. The shape you see, let's see, is compatible with that of an F-35. We can also see in the rear part the plume, that is the heat trail from the F-35's engine, which still leaves a noticeable trace. And then we have the interception that happens through a missile. You see it's a line with a sort of smoke trail behind it. That is the infrared trail of the missile's engine. We can think of a missile, therefore surface to air, short range, and infrared guided. Here we see, well, this flash you see is the infrared trace of the explosion of the warhead, definitely a fragmentation warhead that hits right at the exhaust section. So it looks like the classic interception by an infrared guided missile.
Notice that here you can see the classic engine exhaust with an additional one on the side,
which could be a fuel leak, oil, or something else. Here, in fact, something does seem to have happened.
I'll show you the classic video that has exactly the same grid and so on, but look at the difference. Every time they showed us the videos, this is the downing of a drone, I think a Reaper or an Israeli drone. Notice that they show you the whole video. They follow the target after it's been hit. They show it falling on fire and so on. So we have a semi-confirmation from the American side where they say that an F-35 had to make an emergency landing. There's a wounded pilot consistent with shrapnel, probably from this Iranian system, which damaged the F-35, but it wasn't able to. Meanwhile, this shows us things we didn't know. It's a good absorber.
Yes, it makes sense, because if we look at the rear part of all modern aircraft, around the nozzle, it's protected on the sides, shielded specifically to protect against heat. The surprising thing is that it doesn't release. An F-35 that doesn't maneuver, flies, doesn't release any kind of countermeasure, no kind of flare. It gets hit by the missile. The exhaust is shielded. It helps protect the aircraft. It has already happened historically that fighters manage to return to base damaged by shrapnel, apart from the A-10S, but it has happened a few times. It can happen to anyone. It's a good absorber. Yes, it makes sense. We didn't know, but given its structure, we can also expect it. Then we should see what actually landed, in what condition it landed.
What's the point of the F-35 flying so low? So much so that probably one of these little trucks came out from a location, spotted it, shot at it, so it didn't even have time. No early warning or anything like that. Why was an F-35 flying so low and so quietly?
So the F-35 has a self-protection suite called Distributed Aperture System. They are sensors that cover a 360-degree bubble. I believe there are 6 sensors that cover everything happening around the aircraft and are specifically used to identify incoming missiles. But there's always a difference between theory and practice, between the test range and the operational world. What do we know? If that pilot had 50 alarms in the last hour, maybe he got annoyed and the 51st wasn't a false alarm. Or more simply, a system malfunction, or maybe he just felt safe. Let me remind you that an F-117 was shot down over Serbia due to a series of mistakes and bad luck, so why can't this be another one of those cases? And another F-117 was damaged and then scrapped because it was too damaged to be repaired. So, war works one way, the firing range works another. We'll probably know the difference between theory and practice after some time. But this whole story serves to remind us that a 5th-generation stealth fighter is not invincible. It's not immune to being shot down, to being damaged, to anything, not to a mistake, not to a malfunction. Sooner or later, it was bound to happen that an F-35 would be shot down with these rates of operation, with these emissions. It could even have been a planning error. They thought the area was clear. They sent it in at low altitude. There are 1,000 possibilities. Being stealth is like wearing a helmet on a motorcycle. It protects your head, but it doesn't protect the rest of you. It's not an invincible armor, and that's something to remember. We shouldn't mythologize technology, not even 5th-generation technology. Here, this is the diagram of the DAS. I'll just say this, we have to be realistic. It can happen.
But by the way, if I may, without knowing how many sorties they make, then maybe at the altitudes where this risk exists. It could even be a success story, the use of the F-35 in this conflict. I mean, we don't know if they're doing hundreds and hundreds of sorties at an altitude where they're actually exposed to these infrared systems. maybe even a single damage could be considered a success. Or on the other hand, if there have only been a few sorties and actually just a few missions. It turned out that at least this incoming missile warning system doesn't work properly. In this case, it might not be a success, but I mean, not necessarily, I agree, not necessarily. Are we facing the disaster of the F-35? Well, absolutely not. Also because damage to an aircraft. Actually, everything leads us to think that there are numerous sorties in this conflict. I'll just add that, in fact, one of the reasons why maybe the warning system didn't work, which is what, correct me if I'm wrong, Leonardo, it's the one that basically also allows the use of thermal decoys in the most optimal way and the start of evasive maneuvers. So the missile needs to be detected in time. In this case, it's obviously a missile that was launched when the aircraft was either at medium altitude or low altitude. Now, it's not really understandable, though. Basically, those missiles, as far as I know, reach a maximum altitude of 5 kilon or something like that. So there's already little time from the launch. It could also be the case that it simply wasn't calibrated for that particular type of missile, because after all, these are Iranian indigenous weapons that have been used. I think nothing so far, or almost nothing, except for the downing of those drones. And maybe they just don't have those thermal signature characteristics when they're launched that were expected, which might be those of other more well-known Russian missiles and so on and so forth. So it could be a case where you can simply learn from this malfunction and basically fix the software. Allow me to use the term to improve future efficiency. So even this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a system that doesn't work by default.
No, absolutely, that's right. And maybe it's the same problem that the Indians had with the Chinese PL-15S used by the Pakistanis. They couldn't recognize its infrared or radar signature. Modern warfare wasn't there.
The timing. Flying low, you might be able to recognize it, but if it comes at you in 20 seconds,
that's it.
Let's look at the other point.
Daniele Trump asks for help from the Americans, then says he doesn't want it, then that he doesn't need it, then that they do everything on their own, then that they're not coming.
And so on with the Europeans.
Of the Europeans. Europe doesn't want to be dragged in. And we've seen Daniele Trump make threats, both from the point of view of gas. Okay, he doesn't want to limit it. Let's see if they'll like it if we take away their gas. And I don't know if behind him there's this turnaround of so many ships that were headed to Europe and instead went to Asian markets on the other side. So then we'll also let Eduardo and Lanzara join in, since they weren't able to protect their bases well in the various Gulf countries. Which, by the way, they're wondering if these provide security or bring trouble, since they're being used as launch bases for American attacks, and this involves them more than it protects them. I think this is the same question the Europeans are asking themselves. Fortunately for us, the Iranians don't have a great capacity to strike Europe. However, generally speaking, we're noticing that the Americans are relying more and more on these bases. I don't know if any politician realizes this, because there's Trump, who threatens to leave NATO, who can do it without the Senate saying that we're freeloaders. But in the end, it always comes back around. He needs these bases.
They pointed this out to him. For example, the other day, the German Chancellor Merz told him, "You can insult us, threaten us, blackmail us, wish for us all you want, but..." Because then it's a relationship that has an almost schizoid attitude. It seems, let's say, trivial to say, but it's not the attitude of a president of the United States of America, really not. The history of the United States of America is full of presidents who have made mistakes. It's one of the things you also see in American podcasts. Even this morning, they were making comparisons between Trump and Bush Jr., Bush the son. He went to Parliament for days trying to convince them before attacking Iraq. Considering the outcome, it would have been better if he hadn't convinced anyone. The problem now is tangled up in a situation that has become very serious for Europeans over the past 15 months, in the sense that he consistently has been saying these things about Europeans for 40 years, calling them traitors. We're fed up with you. We don't need you. The Europeans will need some of your guests. I've talked about it. It's not a secret. For example, with General Camporini, whom I respect a lot, he told me Europe will need at least 5 years before it has autonomy. So let's take 5 years as a period, probably even much more than 5 years. Trump knows he can slap us and we just take it. We know that he does it. And until we are able to defend ourselves, we have to deal with it every day, 2 or 3 times a day. Earlier, you were talking about Diego Garcia. I want to remind you of something that I think has been completely overlooked by the Italian media. Look, a year ago, the British, who have been ordered by the United Nations for years to leave Diego Garcia.
We said it at the beginning. They refused to give it up, to let it be used back then.
At least a year and a half, a year since Rubio had given the United States State Department had given the green light in London to the compromise agreement for a 99-year lease with Diego Garcia, which returns to Mauritius. So you say one thing, but put yourself in the shoes of those who negotiated in London. So you agreed with the Americans on a solution that saves face, so that sovereignty returns to Mauritius, but in reality, for 99 years, probably no one will make you leave. Then this guy comes along and tells you that you're an idiot for making that agreement. Then the Spaniard comes along and says, you have to give me the bases in Spain. And the other guy says, no, I'm not giving them to you because you're going to start a war. And NATO is a defensive organization. And you can't use the bases for that. Trump's response. That day he said, I'll come to Spain and I'll use the Spanish bases anyway. I mean, you have a bunch of politicians who have been humiliated, treated well, offended, and so on, who are actually all in a huge pot, which I would call Europe, which is called the European Union, only on certain issues, on antitrust, on international trade, but not on defense, not on foreign policy. I'll give an example. It may seem like a simple example, but this way we understand each other right away. It's as if in the Italian regions it would be enough for, say, Basilicata or Valle d'Aosta to say, no, Italian government, on foreign policy we don't agree, so you don't move or you just don't move. The European Union really hangs on any one of the 27 countries. The case of Hungary is striking regarding aid to Ukraine because in the end, in December, Hungary accepted it by not participating, not taking on the risks. And since the vote is on April 12th and Orban tries not to be sent home after 16 years.
Of an attack to make it more powerful.
You still have 27 entities that have sovereign powers. Let me give you another example. Macron has offered...
We're digressing too much because I want to finish within 2 hours, so I'd like to wrap up with the topic of lessons.
Absolutely about Europe. I'll give one last example. Macron has offered nuclear coverage to some countries like Poland, as long as France insists on having a seat on the United Nations Security Council. And he doesn't give it up to the European Union, since the European Union means that France itself doesn't really intend to have a true union.
Let's talk quickly about Lebanon, because obviously in the middle of all this mess, there are a lot of attacks and counterattacks. And let's remember that this time they've given the order to evacuate up to the Litani River. If I'm not mistaken, even that is being targeted. Just to give you an idea, please. So that's the situation. This war, which is barely talked about, is overshadowed by everything else.
Allora, those who watched Parabellum 2 weeks ago will remember that we immediately said there were 2 strategies, one American and one Israeli. The American one, in my opinion, got tangled up in an attempt to find a compromise. I think Trump really needs to find a compromise. I'm not so sure the Iranians need it. Netanyahu has a score to settle. Astro di Gaza, with 47 years of the Ayatollah's regime, whose main goal is the destruction of the state of Israel and Hezbollah. In Lebanon, which is much more fragile than before, but at this point becomes a fantastic prey in southern Lebanon, because Iran has to think about its own problems. Hamas is objectively in a difficult situation. Hezbollah has been hit significantly, not decisively, but significantly. Syria closed the border to them last week. But the main point is that within the Lebanese political world, even some of the Shiites have said, enough with Hezbollah now. We as human beings, beyond being Shiite, Sunni, or Christian, we want to think about a future as Lebanon. So, on one hand, Hezbollah is in a lot of trouble, and on the other hand, for Netanyahu, this is the deal of his life, meaning he enters the history books. According to him, if he manages to empty southern Lebanon, he will empty it. This morning, as you saw, they blew up 5 bridges right on the Litani River, the ones you were showing. What's the purpose of blowing up those 5 bridges? You move the population north of the Litani, and then you blow up the bridges. At that point, it becomes difficult for the refugees to return from the north to the south.
Also because they're not even going there. The other day, they basically hit the intelligence headquarters, the command center. Look at the methods they're using, regardless of the fact that you're hitting a military target. All around there are also houses, let's say civilian ones, and this is just demolition.
Absolutely. So this is an operation that resembles the one in 82 Peace for Galilee. This is an operation in which, in my opinion, Israel, be aware that almost all of Israeli public opinion agrees with this operation, which Israel says. Dear Lebanese, for 20 years now, Lebanese government, you should have kicked Hezbollah out. You didn't have the courage, the strength, or the means to do it. Now, for us, there's an opportunity because at this moment, Israel is isolated anyway. It's still a public opinion that has to manage on its own. Let's put it this way. Even in the United States, don't underestimate the division that's happening, even criticism towards Israel. In the United States of America, it's very strong. Allora, and to kick them out. This afternoon, as you saw, there was a minister, I think it was Katz, who almost said that we're going to kick them out to the north of the Litani. We'll keep that part for ourselves. I mean, it's not like we're sending them away. We take the Hezbollah, and then once they're sent away, the Hezbollah come back. But since we're at it, the temptation is strong. Then you have a terrible, terrible front, which is the West Bank. In the West Bank, war crimes are happening, civilians of all kinds against the Palestinians, crimes. They're called crimes. Even part of Israeli public opinion says so because there is no consensus on this. While there is consensus about entering Lebanon, there is absolutely no consensus about considering the West Bank a kind of social slaughterhouse. So all this combination, in my opinion, knowing him, I have also met him. I spent 2 hours alone with Netanyahu when he was Israel's ambassador. Nationally, he's a character not to be underestimated, in my opinion. And for him, this is the opportunity of his life. He doesn't care how things end up for Iran as a regime, in my opinion, but he cares about being able to say, okay, I landed a big blow in Gaza. I made an impression that betrayed the principle that he has always been the man who guaranteed Israel's security, even at a cost. The most reactionary right, violating the Constitution. Every now and then he tries to end the game. Here he tries. I have the impression that this situation will go on for quite a while. I mean, there's no respite, there's no solution. And precisely because Lebanese society, even a part of the Shiites, has had enough. I'd like to point out that this morning, the Lebanese government expelled the Iranian ambassador and dozens of Iranian officials and intelligence agents from Lebanon. So there is the political will in Lebanon to get rid not only of Hezbollah, but also of the Iranians. But there isn't the political strength in the sense that their alternative is to have a new civil war. And they, between having it, risk handing Netanyahu the solution to a problem that they can't face, let alone solve.
Okay, then, gentlemen, we will be back in a couple of days to update you on the war in Ukraine, probably on the 27th. By the way, in the middle of all this mess, the Ukrainians attacked a Russian system in the Baltic that was handling over 1 million barrels. So this also increases the crisis because they are obviously trying to reduce, in short, the profits that the Russians can make from this crisis, given the rising prices. I want to thank all our guests, Leonardo Lanzara, Eduardo Fontana, Daniele Moro, and we'll see each other on the 27th unless something crazy happens. Good night.
Goodbye, everyone.